The courthouse was buzzing with a heavy air of anticipation, the kind that only comes when something much larger than legal procedure hangs in the balance. Reporters gathered outside with cameras. Jurors filed into their seats quietly, and the public gallery was filled with restless murmurs. It wasn't just another trial, it was the trial. The man seated at the defense table was accused of crimes so vile that even the most hardened officers struggled to sit near him. His presence seemed to darken the room. His sharp eyes flickered across the courtroom, but he avoided looking directly at the jury. At the prosecution's table, files lay stacked neatly, and a calm but stern-looking attorney shuffled papers, rehearsing in his head the questions that could make or break the case. Every second mattered. Every word mattered. Yet beneath all, the tension and procedure, one thing seemed oddly out of place in the courtroom that morning: the police dog. Max, a German shepherd with a sturdy build and intelligent eyes, sat quietly by his handler near the witness stand. He wasn't restless, didn't fidget, didn't bark. He simply waited. His thick coat gleamed under the dim lights. His chest rose and fell with steady rhythm, and his gaze scanned the room with the patience of a seasoned guardian. To some, he looked like any other K-9 officer called in for presence. To others, especially those who had worked with him, Max was more than just a dog. He was a symbol of protection, a silent reassurance that truth would surface. The judge entered, gavel in hand, his expression stern as usual. He had presided over dozens of cases, but even he knew this trial carried extraordinary weight. His robe swept the floor as he climbed to his seat. He peered over the bench at the assembled crowd, acknowledging the jury with a nod. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the trial formally resumed. The courtroom quieted, tension sharp enough to cut through. Witnesses would be called. Testimonies would be scrutinized. And yet, the atmosphere felt like something more was waiting to happen, though no one could put their finger on what. Then the door creaked open. Heads turned as a young woman walked in, holding the hand of a child. The mother's steps were hesitant, her shoulders tense, as though every movement toward the witness bench was a burden. Her face carried exhaustion, the kind that comes from both sleepless nights and the emotional strain of trauma. She clutched her daughter's hand tightly, perhaps too tightly, afraid that letting go meant more than physical distance. The child couldn't have been more than 3. She wore a faded yellow dress, the kind you'd expect at a birthday party rather than a courtroom. Her other arm clung to a stuffed bear, worn from years of hugs and comfort. Her big brown eyes darted around the room, taking in the faces of strangers, the polished wooden furniture, the giant flags looming behind the judge. But she didn't cry. She didn't whimper or resist. Instead, her eyes settled on Max. The dog's ears flicked up immediately. He didn't move closer, but his gaze locked onto the little girl in a way that made several jurors shift in their seats. For a moment, the chaos of the courtroom, the tension, the hum of whispered conversations, all of it fell away. It was just a child and a dog, staring at one another as if they had met before. The judge raised a brow, clearly surprised. "Who is this?" The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, this is not a sworn witness. She is the daughter of the victim's primary witness. A mother is here to testify, and the child has been brought along simply because there is no one else to care for her today." The judge frowned slightly, glancing toward the child. "A courtroom is no place for a toddler." The defense attorney smirked, adjusting his tie. "I'd say, Your Honor, it's highly inappropriate. Children can be distracting." The mother's grip on her daughter's hand tightened, fear flashing across her face, as though she had done something wrong by simply showing up with her child. But before the judge could issue a decision, the toddler tilted her head and took a small step forward. Her eyes were still locked on Max. She tugged at her mother's hand, but the woman shook her head nervously. The little girl didn't give up. Her small voice, barely above a whisper, drifted into the silence. "Doggy." Gasps rippled across the room. It wasn't the word itself, it was the clarity of it. The child hadn't spoken in public since the night of the incident, according to reports. Many believed she had been too traumatized to speak at all. Yet here, in the middle of a courtroom filled with strangers, she had found her voice again. Max didn't move, but his tail tapped lightly against the floor, a subtle thump-thump as though acknowledging her presence. The handler shot him a quick look, surprised at his reaction. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Proceed," he said quietly, though his voice lacked its usual firmness. Something about this moment unsettled him. He couldn't explain it, but he knew to let it unfold. The mother guided her daughter toward the bench and sat down, trembling as she prepared to testify. The little girl climbed onto the seat beside her, clutching her teddy tightly. But her gaze steady, unflinching remained on Max. Lawyers shuffled. Papers, the jury leaned forward, but everyone's attention was drawn to the silent exchange between the child and the dog. The mother cleared her throat, her voice shaking as she began recounting the night she and her daughter had witnessed, something no one should ever have to see. The courtroom listened intently, yet even as words filled the air, the child's quiet presence pulled at every heart in the room. She was too young to understand the intricacies of trials, of legal jargon, of justice. And yet, in her silence, she carried a weight heavier than most adults could bear. As the prosecutor asked the mother about specific details, the girl reached down, setting her teddy bear aside. Slowly, deliberately, she slid off the bench. The mother froze mid-sentence. The prosecutor hesitated. The judge leaned forward, but no one stopped her. The little girl's small shoes tapped softly against the wooden floor as she made her way toward Max. The German shepherd stayed perfectly still, his handler tightening the leash, but not pulling him back. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The girl stopped in front of Max, looked up at him with wide eyes, and lifted her tiny hand toward his head. The handler began to protest. She shouldn't. But before he could finish, Max lowered his head slightly, allowing the toddler's hand to rest gently between his ears. A hush fell over the room. Jurors exchanged glances. The judge set down his pen. Even the defendant, usually smug, shifted uncomfortably. The child didn't look at anyone else. She didn't smile or cry. She simply stood there, her hand on Max's head, as though this moment was the safest place she had been in a very long time. And for the first time that day, the tension in the courtroom broke, not with words, but with silence so profound it demanded attention. Something extraordinary was about to happen. The air in the courtroom felt heavier after the little girl had walked toward Max in part one. Jurors leaned forward, straining to capture every detail of the moment, while reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. What had started as a typical morning of testimony was quickly becoming something extraordinary. The toddler's hand rested on Max's head with a tenderness that made even the most hardened officers pause. No one knew what she might do next, and that uncertainty only deepened the silence. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the atmosphere. "We will." "Proceed," he said, his voice thinner than usual. He gestured toward the prosecutor. "Continue with the witness testimony." The prosecutor, a seasoned man with decades of courtroom experience, nodded and turned back to the girl's mother. But his eyes couldn't help flicking toward the child, who still stood with Max. There was a peculiar connection unfolding before everyone's eyes, and even he couldn't ignore it. "Mrs. Hernandez," the prosecutor began, addressing the mother gently, "can you please tell the court what you witnessed on the night of May 12th? The woman's voice wavered as she began. She described hearing shouting outside her apartment, the sudden sound of glass breaking, and the chilling moment when her front door had been forced open. Her hands shook as she recalled clutching her daughter, hiding in the corner, praying. The danger would pass. The jury listened closely, their expressions shifting between horror and sympathy. Every detail added weight to the prosecution's case. But as she spoke, her daughter, who had stayed beside Max, suddenly looked up at the dog again. Her lips parted, but no words came. She tilted her head slightly, almost as if listening. To something only she could hear. The mother's testimony faltered. Her gaze darted toward her child, torn between finishing her statement and rushing to scoop her up. The judge noticed her hesitation. "You may take a moment," he said, his tone unusually kind. The woman nodded, blinking back tears. But the child remained calm. She placed both hands on Max's fur, steadying herself as if the dog were an anchor in a storm no one else could see. Gasps rippled through the gallery when the girl suddenly let go of her teddy bear, letting it drop to the floor. She wasn't clinging to it anymore. She was clinging to Max. The defense attorney rose sharply. "Your Honor, I object. This child is clearly a distraction to the witness and the jury. She is not part of these proceedings." The judge opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the toddler began walking again, this time straight toward the witness stand where her mother sat. The bailiff moved instinctively, but the judge lifted his hand. Let her be. His words surprised everyone, even himself. He wasn't sure why he said it, but something in his gut told him not to interfere. The little girl climbed onto the bench beside her mother, pressing herself close against her. The prosecutor hesitated, then continued. "Mrs. Hernandez, can you tell us what happened when the intruder entered your home?" The woman inhaled shakily. He came in with a weapon. He looked around, and when he saw us, he said we had seen too much. I thought." Her voice cracked. She wrapped an arm around her daughter protectively. "I thought it was the end." The courtroom was utterly silent, except for the faint scratching of reporters' pens. And then, the prosecutor urged gently. The mother swallowed hard. Then, the police arrived. "And Max," her voice softened as she looked down at the German shepherd. "Max was the first one through the door. He stood between us and the man. He didn't move, didn't back down. He protected us." All eyes turned to the dog, who sat stoically, unfazed by the attention. His presence seemed to swell with each word spoken. But it wasn't the mother's testimony that shocked the room. It was the sudden sound of a small, clear voice. The toddler lifted her face from her mother's side and whispered just loud enough for the microphone to catch. "Good boy." Every head in the room snapped toward her. The jurors froze, the attorneys stared, and even the judge's gavel paused mid-her. For a second, it was as if time itself had stopped. The mother's eyes filled with tears instantly. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her body shaking. This was the first time her daughter had spoken since that night. Doctors had said it might be months or even years before trauma allowed her to utter a word again. Yet here she was, her tiny voice carrying across the courtroom, addressing not her mother, not the judge, but Max. The German shepherd's ears perked at the sound, and he wagged his tail once, softly, almost reverently. The defense attorney shot up again, flustered. "Your Honor, this is unacceptable. You cannot allow a child's random words to influence the proceedings." But the judge didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the girl. His grip tightened on the gavel, but he couldn't bring himself to bring it down. Something inside him, something deeper than law books and courtroom protocol knew, this moment mattered. The prosecutor stood frozen as well. He didn't dare interrupt. The jurors looked at one another, some with watery eyes, others simply stunned into silence. The toddler wasn't finished. She lifted her tiny hand, still trembling slightly, and pointed it across the room straight at the defendant. Man's face went white. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, shockwaves of disbelief ricocheting off the wooden walls. Reporters scribbled frantically, jurors whispered, and even the bailiff's stern composure cracked into something close to awe. The girl's voice came again, fragile but unmistakable. "Bad man." The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. The defense attorney shouted over the noise. "Objection! This is outrageous. She is 3 years old. She doesn't understand what she's saying." But no one seemed to hear him. The prosecutor's lips parted in shock. The judge sat frozen, and Max shifted slightly, pressing his body closer to the child, as though shielding her. The mother sobbed openly now, holding her daughter tightly. She knew better than anyone the weight of those words. She had begged for her child to speak again, to break free from the prison of silence trauma had built. And now, in the most unlikely place of all, she had. The judge finally lifted his gavel, but his hand trembled. He looked at the defendant, then back at the little girl. His voice was unsteady as he called for order, but deep down, everyone in that room knew order had already been shattered, that something had shifted. The storm had finally broken, and this trial would never be the same again. The words were small, barely more than a whisper, yet they hit the courtroom with the force of a gavel slamming down. "Good boy." The toddler's voice was delicate, almost too soft for the microphone to pick up, but everyone heard it. Every juror, every lawyer, every reporter with a pen frozen above their notepad. Even the defendant, who had been slouched casually in his seat, sat upright, his eyes widening as though he had seen a ghost. For a long moment, the courtroom was silent, so silent it seemed as if no one dared breathe. The mother wept openly, her shoulders shaking as she clutched her child closer. It wasn't the words alone that undid her. It was what they represented. Since that night of horror, since the screams, the breaking glass, the shadow of the man who had burst into their home, her daughter hadn't spoken. Doctors called it selective mutism brought on by trauma. Therapists said her voice might return one day when she felt safe. And now, of all places, of all times here in a courtroom brimming with fear and strangers it had. The German shepherd, Max, had not moved much since she placed her hand on his head. But at the sound of those two words, his ears lifted. His tail wagged gently, once, twice, a subtle acknowledgement of the praise. To him, it may have been nothing more than recognition. To everyone else, it was a miracle unfolding in real time. The judge, normally composed and unmoved, froze in his seat. His gavel hovered in the air, forgotten. He had presided over murder trials, complex civil cases, high-profile frauds, but never had a single phrase from a child disrupted the very rhythm of justice like this. The defense attorney, red-faced and flustered, sprang to his feet. "Objection. Your Honor, this is nothing but distraction. The child is not competent to testify. She's 3 years old. She has no understanding of truth or lies." The judge opened his mouth, but the sound caught in his throat. For the first time in his long career, he found himself speechless. He didn't bang his gavel. He didn't scold the defense. He simply watched. The girl's tiny hand tightened on Max's fur. She looked across the courtroom again, her gaze unblinking, steady in a way that no one expected of a toddler. Her lips moved once more. This time, the words came sharper, clearer. "Bad man." The gallery erupted. Gasps, murmurs, whispered prayers all rose at once like a wave crashing against the walls. The jurors shifted, some covering their mouths, others exchanging wide-eyed looks with each other. The reporters nearly tripped over their notebooks, pens scribbling furiously. And the defendant? His face drained of color. For the first time since the trial began, the smirk was gone. His hand twitched against the table. He tried to avoid her gaze, but her finger stayed pointed at him, unwavering. small yet accusing. The defense attorney slammed his palm against the table. This is outrageous. A child cannot be used to prejudice the jury. She has no sworn oath, no ability to comprehend, but his words felt hollow, even to himself, because the courtroom wasn't reacting as though they'd heard a coached child parroting phrases. They reacted as though they had just witnessed truth pour from the purest, most untainted source imaginable, innocence itself. The prosecutor remained standing, eyes wide but heart racing. He hadn't planned this. No one had. Yet, he knew, in Neo, that moment that the case had shifted. The fragile balance that had teetered between circumstantial evidence and doubt was now tipped. Not because of legal strategy, but because of something no legal training could prepare for. The judge finally found his voice. "Order," he barked, slamming the gavel. The sound echoed like thunder. Slowly, the chatter subsided, though the energy in the room still crackled. He turned toward the prosecutor. "Mr. Lawson, continue." Quickly. The prosecutor nodded, though his throat was dry. He addressed the mother again, careful not to pressure the child. "Mrs. Hernandez, you said Max was the first officer into your apartment. Did your daughter see him that night?" The mother nodded, wiping tears from her face. "Yes, he stood between us and the man. She remembers him. She never forgot. Him." The prosecutor glanced at the little girl. "Do you remember Max?" The toddler didn't answer in words this time. Instead, she hugged the dog's neck tightly, burying her face in his fur. The gesture alone was enough to twist the hearts of every juror. The defense attorney rose again, desperate. "Your Honor, I demand that this interaction be stricken from the record. It's irrelevant, emotional manipulation, and highly prejudicial." The judge's hand hovered over his gavel once more, but he didn't slam it this time. He studied the child for a long moment. Then, in a voice softer than anyone expected, he said, "Overruled." Gasps echoed again. The defense attorney nearly collapsed back into his chair. The little girl looked up, sensing the attention. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, shifted once more to the defendant. For the first time, she spoke a sentence, not rehearsed, not prompted. Just simple, raw truth. "He scared me." The mother pulled her closer instantly, kissing her forehead, whispering, "It's okay, baby. It's okay." But the damage was done. Those words, fragile yet unshakable, landed heavier than any testimony so far. The defendant shifted again, his jaw clenched. Beads of sweat rolled down his temple. The jury noticed. The bailiff, a man who had worked security for over a decade, wiped his eyes discreetly. He had seen hardened criminals, violent brawls, dramatic outbursts, but nothing struck him like the quiet honesty of a child calling out fear. The prosecutor pressed gently. "Sweetheart, did Max make you feel safe?" The girl nodded. Double quotes. "Did the man make you feel unsafe?" Another nod, followed by a quiet, "Yes." It wasn't much, but it was enough. The jurors leaned forward. The courtroom leaned forward. Even the judge leaned forward. In those moments, the polished rules of procedure, the structured dance of objections and counter-arguments, all of it faded. What remained was the undeniable truth that sometimes the smallest voices carried the greatest weight. The defense attorney sat hunched, his notes useless, his arguments faltering. He had prepared for cross-examinations, expert witnesses, forensic details. But he hadn't prepared for this. The mother held her daughter close, tears streaming freely. She knew what everyone else was just beginning to realize. This trial was no longer about evidence alone. It was about a child's memory, her courage, her fragile words cutting through lies like glass. The judge leaned back, his gavel resting on the bench. He rubbed his temple, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betrayed something unusual emotion. In his decades of service, He had learned to keep feelings at bay, to rule by law and law alone. But this was different. The courtroom sat in stunned silence once more, waiting, watching. The toddler's hand slid back down to Max's fur. She whispered, almost to herself this time, "Good boy." And the judge froze again, because he knew so did everyone else, that too simple words had changed everything. The moment the toddler's tiny finger extended toward the defendant, the room became unbearably still. Her small voice, soft yet sharp with innocence, carried across the courtroom. "Bad man," she whispered. 2 words, so simple, yet they thundered through the chamber louder than any testimony given by adults in days of trial. For a split second, no one breathed. The stenographer's fingers hovered above the keys, paralyzed. The defense attorney half rose from his chair, mouth agape, but even he seemed unable to summon an objection immediately. It was as if the entire machinery of law had ground to a halt in the face of a child's unshakable clarity. The judge blinked, lowering his gavel slowly. His hand trembled just enough for the movement to be noticed by those closest to him. He had presided over countless cases, murder trials, fraud schemes, high-profile scandals, but never had he witnessed something this raw, this unfiltered. Judges dealt in evidence, procedure, rules. Yet here stood a 3-year-old girl, clutching nothing but a teddy bear, making an accusation that cut through layers of legal argument like a blade through silk. Her mother gasped, pressing her hand to her lips. Tears welled in her eyes, not only from the shock of hearing her daughter speak words she hadn't uttered since that horrific night, but also because of the unbearable truth in them. This wasn't rehearsed testimony. She hadn't coached her child, hadn't dared to. Trauma had silenced the girl for months, yet here, in the presence of Max, the police dog, her voice had returned. Max stood perfectly still beside her, his brown eyes calm yet alert. His ears twitched slightly, picking up every whisper and movement in the room. He didn't move toward the defendant, didn't growl, but his quiet authority filled the silence. The toddler pressed her little face against his fur for courage, her finger still unwavering in its direction. Finally, the defense attorney snapped back into motion. His voice rose sharply, almost panicked. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly improper. The witness is a minor, incapable of comprehending the gravity of." But his words were drowned by a collective murmur from the jury box. Some jurors sat forward, their eyes wide. Others whispered to each other, shaking their heads as if processing what they had just seen. They weren't merely startled by the words. They were moved deeply, perhaps even persuaded. The prosecutor rose slowly, her face composed, but her eyes glinting with something fierce. She didn't rush. Instead, she allowed the moment to breathe, to imprint itself fully in the minds of everyone present. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but resonant. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, "you have heard many accounts in this courtroom. Testimonies, expert statements, cross-examinations. But what you just witnessed was not planned. It was not prompted. It was the unguarded recognition of a child who has lived through trauma none of us can fully comprehend. Her words are not strategy. They are truth." The defense attorney shouted again, desperate. "This is outrageous. She's 3 years old, 3. This cannot stand as evidence." But even as he raged, his client sat frozen, his face drained of color. The defendant avoided the girl's gaze, staring down at the table as if her tiny voice had pierced some part of him the law had failed to reach. The judge exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the bench. He could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom on him, waiting for direction. His instinct as a man warred with his duty as a judge. The rules of evidence demanded caution, restraint. But the sight of that small child, pressed into the fur of A calm police dog, whispering the words "bad man," carried more weight than 100 pages of testimony. He tapped the gavel once. Softly, not to silence, but to steady. "Proceed," he said, his voice low, shaky. The prosecutor nodded, sensing the importance of handling this moment carefully. She crouched slightly, addressing the girl not as an attorney, but as a human being. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "you said something very brave. Can you tell us why you called him a bad man?" The toddler turned her head, eyes wide and innocent, but she didn't speak. Instead, she clung to Max, burying her tiny fingers into his thick coat. The German shepherd didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply stood like a pillar of strength, steadying her in a way no adult could. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was thick with emotion. The jurors leaned forward. The spectators craned their necks. Some clutched tissues already. Overwhelmed. Finally, the child peeked out, her voice a fragile thread. "He hurt?" "Mommy," she said. Her mother broke into sobs, shoulders shaking uncontrollably. She had tried for months to shield her daughter, to keep her from reliving the trauma. Yet now, those words, raw, broken, unpolished, spilled into the courtroom. Like lightning, the prosecutor's throat tightened, but she forced herself to remain composed. She looked up at the judge. "Your Honor, this cannot be ignored. The child's recognition is powerful corroboration of the evidence we have presented." The defense attorney shouted louder now, his desperation clear. "This is an emotional stunt. This child cannot testify. This is hearsay. It is irrelevant. It is." The judge raised his hand, silencing him with a single gesture. He looked at the little girl again, still clutching Max, and for a moment, his stern judicial mask cracked. He saw not just a witness, but a survivor, a fragile soul braver than any adult in that room. The jurors were no longer neutral. Some had tears streaming down their cheeks. Others sat stone-faced, not because they were unmoved, but because they were trying to mask the storm inside. The power of innocence had reached them in a way no lawyer ever could. Meanwhile, the defendant shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting. Sweat glistened at his temple. It was subtle, but it didn't escape notice. The jurors saw it. The judge saw it. And above all, the girl saw it. She pointed again, this time without trembling. "Bad man," she repeated, firmer this time. The repetition was like a hammer blow. The court clerk whispered something to the judge, reminding him of procedure. But his mind lingered on what he had just witnessed. This wasn't testimony in the traditional sense, yet it had cut deeper than anything else. The prosecutor seized the silence again, her tone resolute. "Your Honor, this case is about truth. And sometimes, truth is spoken most clearly by those least burdened by fear or strategy. That little girl found her voice today, and it is a voice the court must hear." The judge said nothing at first. He simply studied the scene. The child's trembling but brave stance, the mother's sobs, the dog's quiet steadiness, the defendant's pale face. Slowly, he leaned forward, voice heavy with emotion. "The court acknowledges the significance of what has just transpired," he said, his words deliberate, each one measured. "We will proceed with care, but we will not pretend we did not hear her." A ripple passed through the room. The defense attorney sank back into his chair, defeated for the moment. The prosecutor exhaled in relief. The jury absorbed every word, every movement, every tear. The toddler nestled against Max once more, her tiny body finally relaxing, as though she had delivered a burden far larger than herself. For the first time in months, she had spoken, and the world had listened. As the session adjourned briefly, one thought lingered in everyone's mind. Justice, perhaps, had just found its most unlikely messenger. The gavel rested in the judge's hand, but for the first time in decades, he could not bring it down with certainty. Judge Robert Hensley was a man known for composure, calm, deliberate, never swayed by theatrics. Yet, the moment the toddler's words echoed through the courtroom, his heart stumbled. Bad man. 2 words, spoken with innocence, cut deeper than hours of testimony, documents, or cross-examinations ever could. The room remained suspended in silence, as though the very walls of the courthouse held their breath. Every person present felt the gravity of what they had just witnessed. It wasn't merely a child speaking, it was the collision of purity and justice, the unfiltered truth of someone too young to be influenced. Judge Hensley's gaze lingered on the girl. She sat now on the floor beside Max, stroking the dog's fur. The German shepherd remained still, his dark eyes fixed forward, alert but calm, like a guardian shielding her from everything cruel in the world. Something about the image unsettled the judge. He had seen hardened criminals break down in tears, seasoned attorneys lose their cool, and grieving families erupt in raw emotion, but never had he seen a courtroom bend to the quiet will of a child. The judge's inner conflict for a moment. Judge Hensley considered calling for a recess. His instinct told him the court needed time to absorb what just happened. But another voice inside warned him that any pause might dilute the raw power of the moment. And he couldn't ignore the jurors. Every single one of them had leaned forward, eyes shimmering, hearts clearly moved. If he broke the momentum now, would the truth lose its hold? His thoughts swirled back to the oath he had taken years ago. Justice, he knew, wasn't always about procedure. Sometimes it was about humanity, the moments no law book could anticipate. And this was one of those moments. He set the gavel down gently, hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "Proceed," he finally said, though his voice carried less authority than usual. It wasn't weakness, it was awe. The jury reacts. The jurors shifted in their seats, their expressions telling stories of their own. Some were visibly shaken, dabbing at their eyes. One man clenched his jaw, trying to mask the lump in his throat. Another leaned back, arms crossed tightly, as though holding himself together. Each of them knew what they had just heard could not be dismissed. A toddler, incapable of guile or manipulation, had looked straight at the defendant and called him what she believed he was. For weeks they had been presented with evidence, photographs, forensic reports, testimonies. But this was different. This was human instinct, a child's uncorrupted truth, piercing the layers of legal defense. The defendant's unease. Across the courtroom, the defendant shifted uncomfortably. His lawyer had already objected, but the judge's lack of response left him exposed. He stared down at his hands, trying to appear unaffected, but sweat collected at his temples. His jaw twitched. The girl's tiny voice replayed in his mind, louder with each echo. "Bad man." He stole a glance at the jury and saw what he feared. Most the flicker of belief. His carefully constructed facade was cracking, and no legal strategy could shield him from the raw power of those 2 words. Max, the silent anchor. Max remained the silent center of it all. The seasoned canine had been in countless situations, drug busts, searches, dangerous arrests, but here, in this courtroom, his role felt different. He wasn't simply evidence of law enforcement's dedication. He was a bridge. The girl pressed her face against his fur, whispering softly. Though her words were inaudible, the gentle rhythm of her voice made it clear. She trusted him. And that trust extended beyond the dog. It extended into the room, seeping into every heart watching. Max wasn't just a dog in uniform. He was a symbol of truth, of courage, of safety. Prosecutors seized the moment. The prosecutor, Mr. Daniels, recognized the shift instantly. Years of experience had taught him to look for emotional turning points, and this was the most powerful he had ever seen. He stood slowly, not wanting to break the fragile spell in the air. "Your Honor?" Daniels began carefully, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. What we've just witnessed cannot be ignored. This child, who has not spoken since that tragic night, has found her voice today, in this courtroom, in the presence of this police dog. And what did she say? 2 words. Words that align with the evidence, words that no coaching, no suggestion could have inspired. The defense immediately rose to object, but Daniels pressed forward. This is not theatrics, Your Honor. This is truth. Pure, unfiltered truth, from the only innocent witness who lived through what we are here to judge. The courtroom stirred. Again, but the judge lifted his hand, silencing them. He said nothing, but his eyes betrayed the storm within. The mother's tears on the witness stand, the child's mother wept quietly. Her daughter, who had spent months locked in silence after the night of the crime, had just spoken words that cut straight through the courtroom's walls. She clutched a tissue, but it did little to hide the emotion that poured from her eyes. For so long, she had prayed for this moment, not in court, not under such heavy circumstances, but anywhere. Just to hear her child speak again. To hear her voice. To know that trauma hadn't stolen it forever. And yet, it had returned here. At the feet of a police dog, in the middle of a trial. It was as though fate had chosen this moment to heal, even as justice unfolded. The judge's realization, Judge Hensley leaned back, studying the scene before him. He had presided over countless trials, but none had ever forced him to confront the raw humanity of justice like this. In that moment, he realized the scales weren't tipped by evidence alone. They were balanced by emotion, memory, and the fragile yet powerful voice of a child. He tapped his gavel once, softly, not to silence, but to acknowledge. The courtroom steadied, though its energy remained electric. Let the record reflect, the judge said slowly, that the child's words were spoken without prompting. This court recognizes the significance of what has just occurred. The defense bristled, but the damage was done. A moment had been sealed into history. A courtroom changed forever. From that point on, the trial no longer felt like just another case. Every word, every piece of evidence carried new weight. The jurors, the audience, even the lawyers understood that something extraordinary had unfolded. It wasn't just about crime and punishment anymore. It was about truth, breaking free through the innocence of a child. The judge remained quiet. For the rest of the day, his usual commanding voice subdued. He watched, he listened, but his thoughts returned again and again to those 2 words. Bad man. Words that had pierced the armor of law, reaching into the very heart of justice. When the session finally adjourned, the courtroom emptied slowly, as though no one wanted to leave the place where they had just witnessed something unforgettable. The little girl left holding her mother's hand, Max trotting loyally at her side. Reporters whispered about the day's events, already crafting headlines that would capture the world's attention. But Judge Hensley stayed behind a moment. Longer, staring at the empty witness stand. He knew trials were measured in verdicts and sentences, but this one would be remembered for something else entirely. The day a toddler, with 2 simple words, made the entire justice system stop and listen. And he, a man who prided himself on being unshakable, had been shaken to his core. The air in the courtroom felt charged, as if everyone inside were holding a collective breath. The toddler's soft words, innocent yet undeniable, still lingered in the minds of the jury, the lawyers, and even the judge himself. For a moment, it was as though the trial had been ripped from the cold, structured world of legal jargon and rules, thrust instead into something raw, human, and deeply unsettling. The prosecutor rose slowly, his eyes scanning the jury box. He could feel the shift, the way the scales of justice seemed to tip, no longer in balance. It wasn't just about evidence now. It was about a child's courage, about memory triggered by a dog whose very presence unlocked truth that no adult could coax out. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, voice steadier than he felt inside. "In light of what we've just witnessed, I request permission to reintroduce key evidence. What this child has shown us is not something we can ignore." The defense attorney immediately leapt to his feet. "Objection. This is outrageous. We cannot allow." But the judge lifted his hand, silencing him. His usually firm voice carried a tremor as he spoke. "I'll allow it." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The defense attorney's jaw tightened, his face paling. He knew what this meant. The prosecutor wasted no time. He approached the jury with renewed determination, laying out photographs, timelines, and witness accounts that previously seemed circumstantial. But now, each piece of evidence carried new weight, strengthened by the little girl's recognition. "This isn't just theory anymore," he said, pointing toward the child, who still sat nestled against Max, her small fingers entwined in the dog's fur. "This little girl has connected the final dots. She has identified the man who changed her life forever." The jurors leaned forward. Some clasped their hands tightly. Others furrowed their brows as they pieced it all together. For weeks, this trial had dragged on, with uncertainty clouding their thoughts. Now, clarity was emerging not from them, adults who claimed to know, but from a child who had seen and remembered. Max sat tall and unwavering. He seemed to sense his role, his calm strength acting as the tether between the girl's fragile courage and the courtroom's overwhelming atmosphere. Each time the child stroked his fur, she grew calmer, stronger. The prosecutor displayed a photograph and image of the defendant near the scene on the night in question. Before, the defense had argued that it was coincidental, circumstantial. But now, with the child's small voice still echoing, "Bad man," it didn't feel coincidental anymore. It felt damning. The defense attorney tried to object again, scrambling for footing. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are talking about a toddler, a child whose memory is unreliable, whose words can be easily misinterpreted. This is theater, not justice." But the jury didn't seem convinced. The more the defense spoke, the more desperate he appeared. Meanwhile, the prosecutor stood grounded, calm, letting the truth settle in their minds. The judge's eyes remained fixed on the little girl. He had seen countless witnesses, experts, and testimonies over the years. But nothing struck him like this, an unscripted, unprompted truth from someone too young to manipulate. It was innocence itself speaking, piercing through the noise of legal gamesmanship. He thought of his own children, long grown now, and how impossible it would have been for them, at that age, to lie with such conviction. The court reporter's fingers flew across the keys, capturing every word. The gallery sat silent, spellbound. Even the bailiff, usually expressionless, looked moved, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the child and the dog. The prosecutor continued, weaving evidence together like threads forming a noose around the defendant's claims of innocence. "You've seen the photos. You've heard the accounts. You know the timeline. And now you've witnessed the one voice that truly matters, the voice of someone who was there." The defendant shifted uncomfortably. In his chair, his face glistened with sweat. His eyes darted everywhere except toward the girl and Max. For the first time, the jurors noticed fear in him, not confidence, not defiance, but the unmistakable fear of a man cornered. The child looked up at Max again and whispered something. Only he seemed to hear. His ears perked slightly, but he remained perfectly still. The sight of that bond pulled at the jury's hearts. This wasn't just evidence. It was humanity laid bare. By the time the prosecutor returned to his seat, the weight of his words had filled every corner of the courtroom. The defense scrambled, papers rustling as he whispered furiously to his client, but nothing could undo what had been spoken. The judge rubbed his temple, exhaling slowly. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. He had presided over trials where evidence was shaky, where testimony contradicted itself, where nothing was clear. But here it was undeniable. The truth had slipped through, carried, not by lawyers or investigators, but by the smallest person in the room. He glanced at the jury. Their faces said everything somber, reflective, deeply moved. He knew the defense would attempt to discredit the moment, to label it unreliable. But deep down, he also knew the jurors had already felt the shift. The trial had changed course. The mother wept quietly on the stand, tears of relief mixing with grief. For months, she had prayed that her daughter would find her voice again. And here, in the most unlikely place, before strangers and officials, the words had come. Not only words, but truth. The prosecutor stood once more, voice softer now. Ladies and gentlemen, justice is not always complicated. Sometimes it is as simple as a child pointing to the truth. You have seen it. You have heard it. Now it rests in your hands. As he sat down, silence enveloped the room. Not one person stirred. The judge's gavel tapped lightly, signaling the close of that day's proceedings. His voice, though firm, carried a trace of awe. Court will reconvene tomorrow. But as people filed out, whispers erupted in the gallery. Reporters clutched their notepads like treasure, knowing they had witnessed history. The defendant was led away, his head hanging lower than ever before. His attorney muttered under his breath, frustration evident in every movement. Meanwhile, the child stayed nestled against Max. Her mother scooped her up, pressing kisses into her hair, whispering words of comfort. The girl didn't say anything else, but her tiny hand clung tightly to Max's collar. Unwilling to let go. The judge lingered on the bench after the courtroom cleared, staring at the empty space where the child and the dog had been. He had seen many moments of justice in his career, but this was something different. It wasn't about the law alone, it was about truth cutting through fear. And he knew tomorrow the trial would not simply continue. It would culminate in something unforgettable. The next morning, the courtroom was electric. The events of the previous day had spread beyond the courthouse. Reporters had flooded the press gallery, eager to witness the trial that had been halted by 2 words from a toddler. Even before the session began, murmurs traveled like ripples through the room. Every seat was filled, every eye fixed on the child, her mother and Max, who sat dutifully beside her as if he too understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. The judge entered with a weight on his shoulders heavier than any case he had presided over. He was a man of law, trained to temper emotion, to follow precedent. Yet yesterday had reminded him that justice could not exist in isolation from humanity. 2 simple words, bad man, had rewritten the framework of this trial. And now, everyone waited to see what would happen next. As the session began, the prosecutor, Mr. Daniels, rose with quiet confidence. Your Honor, members of the jury, what we witnessed yesterday was unprecedented. But it is also crucial. The words spoken by this child are not just an emotional moment, they are corroboration, confirmation of the terror inflicted on her family, and the truth of the events that transpired that night. The defense attorney, Mr. Klein, stood immediately, face tense. Objection. The child's statements cannot serve as testimony. She is 3 years old. Her words are influenced by suggestion, fear, or interpretation. We must not allow sentiment to overrule procedure. Judge Hensley raised his hand. Overruled, he said firmly, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the weight of responsibility he felt. The court will proceed. The gallery fell silent. Even Max seemed to sense the tension, his ears twitching as he glanced at the judge before returning his gaze to the child. Daniels approached the witness stand, where the mother sat clutching her daughter. Mrs. Hernandez, can you describe the sequence of events on the night of May 12th, when the defendant entered your home? Her hands trembled as she spoke. She recounted the intruder's forceful entry, the broken glass, the shadows of fear that had loomed over her family. Her voice shook as she recalled holding her daughter close, praying for safety. But this time, she spoke with renewed clarity, buoyed by the presence of Max and the courtroom's attentive gaze. The child watched her mother, but her attention shifted toward Max. She stroked his fur gently, her small hand steady. Then, almost imperceptibly, she whispered, "Safe now." The jurors felt it too. The tiny phrase carried weight beyond its simplicity, a silent acknowledgement that protection had arrived, that fear could be confronted, that justice was within reach. The defense attorney tried again, rising in a flustered attempt to redirect the courtroom. "Your Honor, we cannot base judgment on whispers or gestures from a toddler. This is manipulation." But the judge's eyes were unwavering. "The court has made its position clear. We will continue." The defendant's fear. The defendant shifted in his seat, pale and tense. Until now, he had maintained a semblance of composure, relying on procedural maneuvering to mask guilt. But the child's unwavering gaze, the certainty in her tiny finger pointing directly at him, and the dog's calm, imposing presence began to strip away the last vestiges of his confidence. Sweat dotted his temples. His hands clenched and unclenched. Even the defense attorney seemed to recognize that his carefully laid plans were unraveling. The courtroom, it seemed, had moved beyond the realm of law into something unquantifiable, a realm where innocence, memory, and courage held more power than any argument he could muster. Max and the child Max, for his part, remained vigilant. The German shepherd had been trained for countless operations, yet nothing had prepared him for this delicate human courtroom dance. He sat stoically beside the child, exuding calm and authority. Every subtle shift in his stance seemed to reassure her, and she leaned against him without hesitation. The bond between them had become a silent testimony, a living bridge between fear and courage. Every time the child touched Max, the jurors watched, captivated. The subtle interaction conveyed more than words could. It was safety, trust, and clarity distilled into motion, and the jury could not ignore it. The evidence revisited Daniels, laid out key pieces of evidence, photographs of the crime scene, a timeline of the intruder's movements, and witness statements that aligned with the child's observations. Before, these details had been technical, even abstract. Now, with the child's voice accompanying them, they gained immediacy and urgency. The photographs of shattered glass and disturbed furniture no longer felt like cold images. They became pieces of a narrative solidified by human memory. Every document, every testimony, felt alive, anchored by the undeniable truth of the child's words. The jury scribbled notes furiously, and even the judge could feel the shift. Evidence, once inert, had become visceral. Truth had taken on a human face, small, innocent, and unrelenting. A silent accusation. Then came the moment that no one would forget. The child looked up from Max, her eyes meeting the defendant's. She spoke again, this time clearly and without hesitation. "Bad man?" The courtroom froze. Even seasoned reporters ceased scribbling. The defendant's body stiffened. His face drained of color. For the first time, the jurors saw real fear. In him, a fear no lawyer could fabricate. The defense attorney stammered, searching for an objection that could survive the weight of a toddler's clarity, but none came. He sank back into his chair, realizing that logic and procedure might no longer save his client. The judge leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. He understood the magnitude of what was unfolding. The law required restraint, but the heart demanded acknowledgement. He exhaled slowly, tapping his gavel lightly, not to command order, but to mark a moment of significance. The turning point at that instant the course of the trial changed irreversibly. What had begun as a procedural examination of evidence now became a test of truth, courage, and recognition. The jurors no longer weighed testimonies and timelines. Alone, they saw the little girl, alive with fear yet emboldened, and the dog, silent and vigilant, and the defendant, cornered by the honesty that no amount of strategy could hide. Daniels spoke again, softer now, almost reverent. Members of the jury, the truth is rarely as clean as we would like it. But today, you have seen it manifest in the purest form. This child's words, her recognition, her fear, and her courage, align with the evidence before you. Justice is not only in documents and photographs, it is in the recognition of truth where it resides. The jurors shifted in their seats, some dabbing at tears, others nodding imperceptibly. It was clear the trial had reached its emotional apex. The scales had shifted, and the defense could do nothing to balance them. The defendant's lawyer whispered something hurriedly, but the words were drowned by the silent weight of the courtroom. Even the bailiff, usually reserved and impassive, watched with an uncharacteristic intensity. The aftermath, when the session finally recessed, the room emptied slowly. Reporters clustered near the exits, already drafting headlines, while the jury filed out in quiet contemplation. The judge remained seated for a moment longer, reflecting on the extraordinary events. The child clung to her mother's hand, still, close to Max. Her small voice had spoken truth, and the entire courtroom had listened. The day had not been won with strategy, nor with eloquence. It had been won by the courage of a child and the steadfast presence of a police dog. As Judge Hensley watched them leave, he knew that history had been made. This trial would not be remembered for arguments or objections, but for the moment when innocence, bravery, and truth converged to shift the course of justice forever. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the final day of the trial began. After a week of extraordinary events, everyone knew that today would be remembered long after the verdict was read. Reporters whispered in corners, jurors shifted nervously in their seats, and even the bailiffs carried themselves with unusual gravity. Yet at the center of it all sat the toddler, nestled against Max, her mother's hand gripping hers tightly. The German shepherd, calm and imposing, remained her anchor, silently commanding the attention of the room. Judge Hensley entered the courtroom, his presence imposing yet thoughtful. The events of the past days had left him unsettled, yet profoundly aware that he was witnessing justice in a form he had never imagined. He tapped the gavel lightly, calling the courtroom to order, but his mind lingered on the child's words. Bad man. 2 words that had pierced the complex machinery of law and exposed the truth in its purest form. The prosecutor, Mr. Daniels, rose with quiet authority. He spoke not just to the jury, but to the entire courtroom, weaving together the weeks. Evidence with the child's unprompted recognition. Members of the jury, the evidence has always pointed to one conclusion. But sometimes, evidence alone is insufficient. Justice often requires courage, honesty, and recognition of truth beyond what is written in documents or spoken by adults. This child has given you that truth, unfiltered and brave. You have seen it, and now it is your responsibility to act upon it. The defendant shifted in his seat, his lawyer whispering frantically. His face was pale, his composure fraying. For the first time, he seemed human, not the calculated figure who had attempted to manipulate every aspect of the trial, but a man confronted by the undeniable reality of his actions. The jury listened rapt. They had spent days processing photographs, timelines, and witness testimonies. Yet none of that had the visceral impact of the little girl pointing her finger, looking directly at him, and saying the words that had altered the course of the trial. Daniels gestured subtly toward the child and Max. Your verdict must reflect truth, not convenience. It must honor the courage of those who cannot lie, who have faced fear and trauma, and yet have spoken clearly and without hesitation. Justice is not only the preservation of law, it is the protection of the innocent and the condemnation of wrongdoing. That is what this trial demands. The defense attorney rose once more, voice tight with frustration. Your Honor, we ask that the jury consider all evidence objectively. They cannot base judgment on the words or gestures of a 3-year-old. This is highly prejudicial, and Judge Hensley held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. The court has considered your arguments. The jury will weigh all evidence, including the testimony and behavior of witnesses. Dismissed. The courtroom quieted as the jurors retired to deliberate. The defendant slumped in his seat, exhaustion and fear etched into every line of his face. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but there was little left to say. The weight of truth pressed upon them like a tangible force. The jury entered the deliberation room, still processing the events of the past week. They had been presented with overwhelming evidence, but it was the child's courage and clarity that had left the deepest mark. Some jurors spoke in hushed tones, recalling the moment she had whispered, "Bad man," and the way Max had stood unwaveringly beside her, a silent guardian. She wasn't coached, one juror said softly. You could see it in her eyes. Pure fear, pure truth. Another nodded. I've never seen anything like it. Evidence is one thing, but that was undeniable. Hours passed. Each piece of evidence was revisited, each testimony weighed. Yet the jury kept circling back to the child's recognition. They couldn't unsee it, couldn't unhear the simplicity and power of her words. Finally, they reached a unanimous decision. The verdict had been decided long before the foreperson's voice broke the room's tense silence. It had been written in the hearts of those who had witnessed the courage of a child and the steadfast presence of a loyal police dog. The verdict. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Every eye was on the jury box as the foreperson stood, clearing her throat. Your Honor, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts, she said, voice steady, yet carrying the weight of the moment. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The child, perched on her mother's lap, looked up briefly, her small eyes wide but calm. Max nudged her gently, as if to offer reassurance. The judge leaned forward, exhaling slowly. This was justice, not only the outcome of the trial, but the triumph of truth, courage, and the unwavering voice of innocence. He looked at the defendant, whose face had paled further, realizing the finality of the moment. Sentence will be handed down immediately, Judge Hensley said, his voice steady now, resolute. This court acknowledges the extraordinary circumstances surrounding this case. The bravery of a child and the loyal presence of a police K-9 has ensured that justice is not only done, but seen to be done. Emotional closure. As the courtroom emptied, the mother hugged her daughter tightly. Tears streamed freely, not just from relief, but from gratitude. Her daughter's voice, once silenced by trauma, had returned when it mattered most. Max remained at her side, his calm demeanor a silent reassurance. The child whispered, "Good boy," her voice clear and strong now. For her, Max had not only protected her physically, but had helped restore her voice, her courage, and her sense of safety. Reporters jostled to capture the story, but no photograph could fully convey what had transpired. The trial had been battle of evidence and law, yes, but it had also been a testament to the power of innocence, courage, and the quiet presence of those who protect without seeking recognition. The judge's reflection later, in chambers, Judge Hensley reflected on the extraordinary events. He had presided over countless trials, seen injustice and triumph, but never had he witnessed something so profoundly moving. 2 words from a mole. 3-year-old had stopped a courtroom, swayed a jury. and reminded everyone present that justice is more than procedure. It is recognition, humanity, and courage in its purest form. He knew this case would be remembered long after the verdict, long after the formalities of the trial. It would be remembered for the day innocence spoke, and the world listened. Aftermath. In the weeks following the trial, a story made national headlines. The toddler's courage became a symbol of hope for victims of trauma everywhere. Max was honored at a special ceremony for his role in the case, and the mother dedicated herself to advocacy, ensuring that other children in similar circumstances had a voice. The defendant faced the consequences of his actions, held accountable, not just by law, but by the undeniable truth revealed through the eyes of a child. The courtroom, once a place of procedure and formality, had witnessed a moment of pure human connection. And as for the child, she spoke freely now, her voice no longer silenced by fear. Her bond with Max remained unbreakable, a living reminder of the courage it takes to face evil and the power of truth, no matter the form it takes. Closing in the end, justice had been served not solely by law, but by courage, by innocence, and by the unwavering loyalty of a dog who never wavered. The world remembered the trial, not just for the verdict, but for the moment when a toddler spoke two simple words, changing the course of a case and the lives of everyone present forever. Bad man. Two words that echoed in history. Two words that proved the smallest voices sometimes carry the loudest truth.